Gotta make sure everything is okay. Just checking. I got a notice that the stream to Facebook stopped, but hopefully it's okay. We're gonna see in a moment. That was Distant Cousins singing Are You Ready? We do seem to be broadcasting. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. All right. Who's going to be with us on a fine Monday night? We're going to cover 4 Mishnas here on our daf and some pretty interesting rulings of the sages. So who's with us? Excuse me. Stephen from Dover, Pauline from Arkansas, Sharon from New Jersey, Yehudit from South Carolina, Harold Black says Shalom, James from Indianapolis, Chaim from Charlotte, Brenna from Massachusetts, Melissa from Great Neck, Paula from Chicago, Reza, Katz from Tampa, Florida, Bill is with us from Arkansas, and Yora saying Shalom from Merced, California, and I'm originally from Budapest, Hungary. You maybe are mentioning that because I shared a story earlier today about my grandmother's passing, so there's something we have in common. Caroline from North Carolina. Bill likes that song from Distant Cousins. I love it too. They're good friends of ours. Beautiful, awesome. Like they're here in LA, and I mean, like just all their songs are terrific with a real spiritual center. Who else is with us? Crystal loves the music too, tuning in from Canada. Oskan is with us from Turkey. Welcome, Oskan. Great to have people from other continents. Brenna says, Hodesh Tov. That's right, it's the new month. We're entering Kislev. It's Rosh Hodesh tonight and tomorrow. I've got a conflict in the morning, so I'm probably not gonna be able to broadcast a Hallel. I'll see what I can do. But yes, we are welcoming a new month, and this is definitely a propitious time to thank God for all the blessings in our lives and ask God to continue the flow of those blessings. We especially want to do that at the beginning of a month. The Hebrew months are lunar months. So when you have a new month, you know that there's a new moon, and in 2 weeks we'll have a full moon. And this is Kislev, which toward the end of the month has Hanukkah, and then Hanukkah is the only holiday that spans 2 months. We'll have a Rosh Chodesh in the middle of Hanukkah as we move from Kislev to the next month. Lucy with us from Minnesota. Stephanie says Alechem Shalom. Eileen says hi. And Nikel is with us from Fort Wayne. And Curtis is with us from Jacksonville in Florida. Lynn with us from Texas, Marasia from Atlanta, Georgia, and Debbie saying good evening from Toms River in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. All right, so as I mentioned, the last couple days, we're in the final chapter of Tractate Eruvin, the final chapter of Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. This chapter 10 has more Mishnas than any other chapter had, 19 of them. So it's a bit of a miscellaneous, almost a miscellany. The sage is kind of throwing in all these final thoughts about how to both guard Shabbos to protect us from coming to do prohibited labors on Shabbos, and to enhance the joy and the sanctity of Shabbos. So since there's so many Mishnahs, the discussions are sometimes quick. And here on this daf, where are we? We're on page 99 of Tractate Eruvin. So that's daf Tzadi Tes. And we're going to have 4 Mishnahs in one daf. That's pretty unusual. So let's get right into it. All right, so the first Mishnah, Mishnah number 4 on this page, Mishnah number 4 of the chapter, has to do with causing objects to move in another domain, even though you may not be standing in that domain. Let's read the Mishnah. A person may stand in a private domain and move objects that are in a public domain, as there is no concern that he might mistakenly bring them into the private domain, right? So you can cause something to move in the public domain, and as we'll see, since you can only carry something 4 cubits in the public domain, you're not going to be able to move it more than that. You might have thought that you shouldn't move, while you're standing in the private domain, you shouldn't move something that's in the public domain, because you might come to pick it up and transfer it into the private domain where you're standing, and then you would be guilty of violating a Torah prohibition and become liable to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing. But the sages are not concerned that we will do that. Let's finish reading the Mishnah. Similarly, one may stand in a public domain and move objects in a private domain, provided that he does not carry them beyond 4 cubits in the public domain, which, as we said, is prohibited on Shabbos. However, a person may not stand in a private domain. And before I continue, I said many times that the sages are going to look into every nook and cranny of human existence to figure out, okay, what is God's will for us to do? You know, how should we conduct ourselves in every facet of human existence? Because the whole concept, it's almost like the basic philosophy of Judaism, is that there's not some kind of a wall between the life of the spirit and the life of the body. Rather, the soul and the body travel together through this world, and we're always trying to elevate our actions so that we can make this physical world inhabited by physical beings doing physical actions a home for the presence of the Holy One. Therefore, we're gonna talk about some pretty frankly bodily concepts and how we're supposed to handle just real bodily issues. Okay, so let me continue. A person may not stand in a private domain and urinate into a public domain. I don't think it's sexist to say that this is more of a issue for men. Women aren't going to do this, right? But men, who do things standing up might, while standing in one domain, cause the urine to go into another domain, and then they would be guilty of that prohibited transfer, of transferring something, in this case urine, but the point is transferring an object from a private domain to a public domain on Shabbos, and that is a prohibited transfer, and you become liable to bring the sin offering. Nor may one stand in a public domain and urinate into a private domain, and likewise, one may not spit in such a manner that the spittle passes from a private domain to a public domain, or vice versa. Rabbi Yehuda says, even once a person's spittle is gathered in his mouth, he may not walk 4 cubits in the public domain until he spits it out, for he would be carrying the accumulated spittle in his mouth, which is similar to carrying any other object. And we're actually going to discuss what Rabbi Yehuda meant by that. We're going to qualify that ruling a little bit. But let's get into the Gemara's discussion of this Mishnah and its fluids, as it were. Okay, so first of all, Rav Chanana bar Shlemiah says, okay, so one may not stand in a private domain and move objects in the public domain at all. Now, the Mishnah just said, you may stand in the private domain and move objects that are in the public domain. So you can cause objects to move. Now, you wouldn't do that with some kind of electric remote control. But I mean, what is the situation? I mean, one such situation is that it's just right next to you where the private domain is, and you can literally be standing in the private domain, reach out with your hand and cause something to move in the public domain. So the Mishnah said you are permitted to do that. Rav Chanana bar Shlemiah says you may not do that. So and he actually said that to Hiya bar Rav, the son of Rav, in the presence of Rav. So it's like the great sage Rav, his son was receiving tutelage from a lesser sage who was in charge of teaching the children. But it was in the presence of the great sage Rav, so Rav interjected in the teaching. He says, whoa. You're teaching my son something that is more stringent than the majority opinion of the sages as expressed in the Mishnah. Your opinion is consistent with one of the sages, namely Rabbi Meir, but his was the minority dissenting opinion. So, where do you now come and abandon the majority opinion because you want to be more stringent? You need to teach the law properly. You need to transmit it properly. And this is an important lesson because, especially as we become more pious and we want to sort of make sacrifices and hold ourselves up to a higher standard, and there are realms where there's a place for that. But even if we're going to be more stringent upon ourselves, we don't rewrite the law and say that the law itself was more stringent than it is, because then you're corrupting the transmission of the oral tradition. And so Rav was careful to say, my friend, get it right. The rabbi said this is permitted, and we're not going to create a stringency and call it the law when that is not the law. Rava said, if somebody standing in the public domain lifts an object over his head, and now he walks more than 4 cubits in the public domain and puts it down on the ground, he is liable to bring a sin offering. Well, we know that if you carry an object more than 4 cubits in the public domain, you're liable to bring a sin offering if you do this on Shabbos. So why would it make any difference if you lift it up over your head? So what he's saying is, by saying it's over your head, so for sure it's going to be more than 10 handbreadths off the ground. And now this object went straight up from the public domain, and now it's moving through the airspace well above the public domain. And that is not the public domain. The object is moving through an exempt space. So you might have thought that since you didn't move the object through the public domain only goes from the ground till 10 handbreadths above the ground. Since you moved it through the air above that, perhaps you wouldn't be liable to bring the sin offering because you didn't really violate Shabbos. Rava comes to tell us, yes, you did. That's not a trick that is going to be available. You can't do that. Even if you lift it up over your head, you're still liable to bring the sin offering. So the Gemara says, but perhaps the Mishna is teaching that one who moves an object from a private domain, one who is standing in the private domain and he causes the object to move in the public domain more than 4 cubits. So it's different. He didn't lift it up and carry the object itself through an exempt space, but he is standing in the private domain and he caused it to move more than 4 cubits in the public domain. Now, this definitely seems to be prohibited. The question is he liable to bring a sin offering? And that is not going to be answered. That sages are not going to resolve that. It seems that it's not resolved. It's definitely prohibited. But the question is, are you violating a rabbinic prohibition or are you violating a Torah prohibition? When you violate a rabbinic decree that was probably enacted by the rabbis to protect us from coming to violate a Torah prohibition, you're not allowed to violate rabbinic prohibitions. It's definitely prohibited, but you don't become liable to bring the sin offering unless you violate a Torah prohibition. And it's not clear what the case is when you're standing in the private domain and you cause something to move more than 4 cubits in the public domain. Rav Yosef says, if a person urinates or spits from the private domain to the public domain. Now, we're not talking about 4 cubits. Now we're talking about carrying an object from private domain to public domain. Or obviously not just carrying, causing it to move from private domain to public domain. Because if you throw a football from a private domain out into the public domain, you're liable for that prohibited transfer, liable to bring the sin offering. You violated a Torah prohibition. So Rav Yosef says, okay, so if you urinate or spit from a private domain out to the public domain, not only is it prohibited, but you are liable to bring the sin offering. The Gemara asks, but wait a minute. If you did that with a football, if you threw a football from a private domain out to a public domain, there would be a lifting and placing, right? You would lift the football in the private domain, take it from being at rest in the private domain, throw it out to the public domain, and it would come to rest in the public domain. So it was lifted, transferred, and placed. When one urinates or spits, did he lift from the private domain, right? What did he lift from? I mean, it's already in his body. It's riding over the ground. Do we say that it's coming from an actual private domain if the spittle is originating in his mouth? And the Gemara answers, yes, because his intent renders the point of origin significant. What is the proof for that? We have a teaching from Rava that if you throw a ball from the private domain out into the public domain, but you throw it to your dog, and your dog catches the ball, and there are a lot of dogs who are very good at catching frisbees and balls, etc. So if the dog catches the object, and that was your intent, to throw it to the dog, so then you violated Torah prohibition and you're liable to bring the sin offering, even though it landed in the dog's mouth, which is not the public domain. He's in the public domain, but maybe he caught it like up in the air above 10 handbreadths, and you might say that the place where it actually landed, even forget the 10 handbreadths, the place where it landed is the dog's mouth. Is that really the public domain? And the answer is yes, even though it's a small area, the dog's mouth, your intent to throw it out there to a dog in the public domain renders the dog's mouth a significant location. And when the ball lands there, you have violated the Torah prohibition. Okay, so now we're going to go there. So the sages say, okay, well, what about if a man is standing in the private domain and he's going to urinate out into the public domain, but the point on his body where the urine is originating, his member, is actually in the public domain. He's standing in the private domain, but, the opening of his male member is in the public domain. So the liquid is going from a place in the public domain to another place in the public domain. Is he guilty of violating a Torah prohibition? So the question would depend on whether we go from where the liquid originated in his bladder or where it, left his body, the opening of his member. The question is asked, and I believe it's left teku, right? They don't resolve this question. Let me just double check. It's so funny. Yeah, exactly. Let it stand, say the sages. Even they were like, well, we're going to ask every question that needs to be asked, but sometimes the discussion is not worth it. And so the answer to that question is, we don't know. They let the discussion stand where it is. The word for that is teku in Aramaic. So we move on. Rabbi Yehuda said that if you gather spit in your mouth, right? Like if you gather a quantity of spit in your mouth and it's like sitting in your mouth, sort of like to the point where you kind of want to spit it out, but you don't, and you walk with a mouthful of spit more than 4 cubits in the public domain, you're liable for carrying in the public domain. You have violated a Torah prohibition, says Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei counters and he says, well, wait a minute. We've learned elsewhere that the spittle in a person's mouth does not become a liquid which renders produce susceptible to tuma until it emerges from the mouth. So the principle there is for food to become ritually impure, to become tameh, it first has to come into contact with one of the 7 liquids that is capable of, that makes the food susceptible to ritual impurity. If it's dry food that has never been touched by a liquid, it cannot become tameh, can't become ritually impure. But as soon as it comes into contact with something like water or spittle, then it becomes susceptible to ritual impurity. But we have a teaching elsewhere that if for some reason you reached inside your mouth, touched some spit there, and then with dirty hands, which transmit ritual impurity, you touch, food set aside for the priests, teruma. So you would have disqualified the teruma because now you gave it ritual impurity, even though it was dry food. What was the liquid it came into contact with? The spit from your mouth. But I'm sorry, there's a dispute there. One says it does render it impure. Rabbi Yosei says it doesn't. Just touching the spit inside your mouth and then touching the food does not render it susceptible to impurity. The spit has to emerge from a person's mouth first. Rabbi Yehuda answers, what are we talking about here? We're not just talking about spit that's resting, kind of on your salivary glands inside your mouth, the sort of usual, our mouths are always a little bit moist. He's saying if the spit becomes detached from the walls of the mouth. In other words, if you've gathered, spit in your mouth, like you're preparing to spit out, that means it's detached from the wall. You're conscious of the spit. It's not the usual moisture in your mouth, but you've gathered spittle in your mouth. So then that becomes a significant object, even though it's riding around the world inside your mouth. If you walk with that more than 4 cubits, you are liable for carrying in the public domain. And this applies to phlegm as well, right? So you're coughing. You're what do you call it? If you have if you have reflux, right? The person who has gastrointestinal condition, GERD. He has reflux, he's often coughing up phlegm, or you have a cold, or God forbid you have COVID. So if you're coughing up phlegm, if it's just a little bit in your nasal passages, not a big deal. But once you hock up a loogie inside your mouth, okay, so, you can't carry that around in the public domain. Now that we're talking about spittle and phlegm, Resh Lakish gets us back on track, and he says, listen, if you spit while you're praying, or you spit in front of your master, meaning your teacher, that's a very bad thing. And he cites a line from Proverbs 8:36, all of them who hate me love death. What is that? Why is he talking about spit? And he's saying that somebody who acts in an unrefined manner and spitting, in people's presence is so unrefined that if you do that while you're praying, meaning you're in the presence of God, or in the presence of your teacher, somebody that you respect because he teaches you Torah, then what have you done? It's not that you hate God, it's that you've made yourself hateful to God. Why? Because a person who is a pious person, a visibly religious person, who then behaves like that, spitting in front of his teacher or in front of God, while he's praying, so that person desecrates the name of God. That kind of unrefined behavior is something we must not do. Well, then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. People who, the reason they're spitting is because something unpleasant is going on for them. It's not like they just have a habit of spitting and think it's okay. It's like they need to spit. It's not voluntary, right? It's just something that came up and they need to do. And the Gemara answers its own question, sure. But when that need arises, leave the presence of your master. If you're praying, walk away from the spot that you've designated for prayer, spit, do what you have to do, and then return. And it's funny that we encounter this page today because last night Nina and I were watching a pretty classic Western. It was research for a script that we're working on called The Outlaw Josie Wales. And people remember Clint Eastwood. It's a great movie, but he's an outlaw. He's the outlaw Josie Wales. And there's a lot of violence in the movie, but one of the sort of habits that he has is he chews tobacco. And so he's often spitting the tobacco juice. It's a pretty disgusting habit, but it happens outdoors, and he kind of uses it to punctuate some of his dialogue. But kind of later in the movie, without giving anything away, he finds himself indoors in the home of a very proper widow from Kansas. And we've seen him, spitting that tobacco juice all through the movie. But now he's in her house, in her presence, and he's about to, turn to the side and spit up that tobacco juice. And she just gives him that look, and he swallows the tobacco juice, which must be really disgusting. But he refrained from spitting that up in front of the lady. And if, the outlaw Josie Wales can refrain from spitting in front of the widow from Kansas, we can refrain from spitting in front of our masters, and particularly in front of the Holy One. Blessed be He. Very good. And that brings us to Mishnah number 5 here in page 99. Mishnah number 5, very short. A person may stand in a private domain and extend his head and drink in a public domain, and he may stand in a public domain and drink in a private domain, but only if he brings his head and most of his body into the domain in which he drinks. And the same applies in a wine press. So, what's going on here? Well, if you the problem is, right, you're getting liquid into your mouth in the public domain, and if you're standing in the private domain, there's going to be a transfer of that liquid, that water that you're drinking, from the public domain to the private domain. So that's not going to be allowed. But the Mishnah says you can stand in the private domain and drink from the public domain, but then the Mishnah itself qualifies that the leniency. It says, but you can only do that if most of your head and most of your body are in the private domain. So your feet might be in one domain, but your location is established according to where most of your body is, right? So your head and most of your body have to be in the same domain where you're drinking for this to be permitted. And it says the same applies for the wine press. What does that mean? So it's interesting. It applies to the wine press, but what we've been talking about is prohibited transfers on Shabbos. With respect to the wine press, the issue is not that there's a wine press like on the edge of a domain and you're standing in a different domain. Rather, this has to do with tithing, right? So when wine is being created in a wine press, it's being manufactured, so it hasn't been tithed yet, right? So if you stand over the wine press with your head and most of your body over the wine press, you can take a casual drink from the wine press. Often, the winemaker is tasting the wine, and he doesn't have to worry that he's consuming something that hasn't been tithed properly yet. However, if he removes the wine from the wine press and steps away from the wine press, now it's as if he's making a meal, right? It's like proper eating, not casual, incidental eating or drinking. So since now it becomes sort of formal, proper drinking rather than incidental or casual drinking, he can't drink that wine unless it comes from tithed wine, right? So whenever we manufacture, whenever we grow grain and produce, or when we create wine, it has to be tithed. A portion has to be set apart for the tithe and before we are allowed to consume it. But we can take some, as long as our head and most of our body is over the wine press. The Gemara adds, if while you're over the wine press, that wine right out of the wine press is too strong to drink, especially the way they drank it in the old days. They always diluted their wine. So if you dilute it with some cold water, you might taste some, drink it, and then just whatever's left over, toss back into the wine press. A little gross, but okay, that's what they did. But if you diluted it with warm water, so then you couldn't toss that back in because the warm water, I guess, would cause a bad reaction in terms of the fermenting and whatever else is going on in the wine press. So since you put warm water, you diluted your wine with warm water, you would know that you're not going to toss it back in. Therefore, it's not casual, incidental drinking, and that's not going to be permitted unless you first set some of the wine apart for a tithe, and then you could, taste whatever you're going to taste. So we cannot drink untithed wine unless our head and most of our body is over the wine press, and if we're diluting it, we're diluted only with cold water. That was our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Mishnah number 6. As I said, they're kind of fast and quick here on this page. Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 10. A person, I'll read the Mishnah, it's short also. A person standing in a public domain on Shabbos may catch water in a vessel from a gutter running along the side of a roof, if it is less than 10 handbreadths off the ground, which is part of the public domain. And from a pipe that protrudes from the roof, one may drink in any manner, i.e. not only by catching the water in a vessel, but even pressing his mouth directly against the spout. So what's going on here? So if it's a gutter running along the roof, well, a roof is a private domain. But if there's a gutter running along a roof and this gutter is below 10 handbreadths from the ground, so then it's considered to be part of the public domain. And when you're in the public domain, you could take water from a stream because it's in the public domain, you're in the public domain, and you're just drinking water while you're in the public domain. But if that gutter that's collecting water right off the roof is above 10 handbreadths, and you're standing in the public domain, that roof is a private domain, you can't drink water directly from the roof. And the gutter that runs along the side of a roof is considered part of the roof. However, if the water gathers on the roof and then there's a spout which distances the water coming off the roof more than 3 handbreadths from the roof, so now it's considered that you're no longer sort of drinking or gathering water from the roof itself. Rather, it's now passing through a different domain. That spout, which is more than 3 handbreadths away from the roof, is now an exempt area. The water's coming through an exempt area, right? Because it's more than 10 handbreadths off of a public domain. It's not a private domain in itself. So now you can drink it. It can go right into your mouth, or you can gather it in a vessel. And you're not going to be violating the prohibition on transferring something from a private domain to a public domain on Shabbos. Qualification: if the spout that the water is running through is more than 4 by 4 handbreadths big, something, as we've seen, that's 4 by 4 handbreadths can be its own domain, right? More than 10 handbreadths above the ground of the public domain, that would be its own private domain, and now you'd have the same problem as if you were drinking right off the roof. You'd be taking from a private domain while you're standing in a public domain. There was one other thing I was going to say. Now you might ask, well, wait a minute, the water was on the roof, which is a private domain, okay, flows through a spout, which is the exempt domain, and then it comes to me and I'm standing in the public domain, but it didn't stop in the spout, it flowed right through. So isn't it actually the same as a prohibited transfer from private domain to public domain? Now, this is not on the page. This is me asking this question. So you might have thought that it's flowing directly from private domain to public domain. It just happens to pass through that spout. Why isn't it a prohibited transfer? But I think we've had this question before. When it comes to water, what matters is where you're getting it from, because the truth is that the water didn't come from that private domain, which is the rooftop. Prior to that, it came from the cloud, and it came from the ocean, or it comes from a lake, or it comes from a river. We know that water, that's flowing in a river. How can we drink that on Shabbos? That water probably started before Shabbos outside of our own domain. And the sages made a leniency with respect to water. Basically, it's where we pick it up is all we have to worry about. So even though it gathered on the roof, where's it coming from? Where does it come to us? From that spout. And as long as that spout is more than 3 handbreadths away from the roof, that's going to be permitted to drink it or gather it in a vessel on Shabbos. Finally, I'm almost done. So if you have questions or comments, make sure they're in there. Very quick. This final Mishnah, number 7, that's on our daf, and this has to do with a well and a dump. With regard to a cistern, right, a well, in a public domain with an embankment 10 handbreadths high, i.e. the embankment constitutes a private domain by itself, if there is a window above the cistern, i.e. the window of an adjacent house is situated above the cistern, So one may draw water from the cistern on Shabbos through the window, as it is permitted to draw water from a private domain to another private domain, as long as you don't cross through the public domain, right? So if the well was more than 4 handbreadths away from the house, so then it wouldn't be considered adjacent to the house, and you'd be passing over possibly through the public domain. But if there was an embankment more than 10 handbreadths high, and you're passing over that, or within, a few handbreadths of that, so now it's just going private domain over a private domain into a private domain. That's going to be permitted. If the embankment wasn't there and the well was more than 4 handbreadths away from the house, we wouldn't be able to make that transfer. Similarly, with regard to a garbage dump in a public domain that is 10 handbreadths high, which means that it has the status of a private domain on the surface of the dump, if there is a window above the pile of refuse that abuts the garbage dump, one may throw water from the window onto the dump on Shabbos, as it is permitted to carry from one private domain to another, right? So you can't throw water out of your window. Your house is a private domain, and let's say that there's a public domain right outside your window. So you can't throw a glass of water, just the water itself, out your window to land in the public domain. We saw that you can't urinate from a private domain to a public domain, and likewise, you can't just throw water out your window. But if right outside your window, there's a pile of garbage that's more than 10 handbreadths high, and more than 4 by 4 handbreadths on the surface of it, so then that is its own private domain, and you can dump the water out. The interesting qualification, this is the last thing I'm going to share, the interesting qualification on that is that it matters who owns the garbage, okay? If this is a public dump, like a city dump that is right outside your window, God forbid, it would not a nice way to live, right outside the dump. But if it's a public dump, some kind of public pile of refuse that's right outside your window, okay, no problem. You can dump the water out your window onto that pile of garbage. But if it's privately owned garbage, if it's somebody's refuse pile, or let's say somebody's responsible for that pile of refuse. Now, it's in a public domain. The garbage is lying in the public domain. But somehow this pile of garbage belongs to an individual, then you cannot dump your water out on it. Are the sages concerned that you're going to, that you're guilty of trespassing, or that you're you're infringing somebody's rights by dumping some water onto their garbage pile? No, that's not the issue. The issue is, if it's somebody's private garbage pile, they might remove the garbage pile. They might decide to clean up the garbage pile. And if the garbage pile was gone, then the land underneath it, which is the public domain, now has the status of the public domain, and the person who throws water out of his house down there, now it's landing in the public domain, and he's guilty of violating a Torah prohibition. He's liable to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing. So the sages decreed against dumping water out your window onto a garbage pile if it's privately owned, because somebody might remove the garbage, and then you would, and then you wouldn't realize it had been removed, and then you dumped your water, and now you're guilty of violating a Torah prohibition. But if it's a public refuse pile, then they're not concerned, because nobody's going to move the garbage pile. All right, that's what we've got today. Let's look at some comments and questions. Lucy, what if you accidentally stumble on a ball your kid left on your threshold so that the ball ends in the street? Did you violate a prohibition? No, because you did not have intent. We said that intent matters, right? You had intent to throw the ball to the dog, so you caused it to be conveyed from one domain to another, and caused it to land in the dog's mouth. Your intent mattered. In your case, you don't have intent to move that ball. It was purely accidental, so you're not going to be liable. I'm pretty sure in your situation, now there's going to be some situations where you might argue, well, was it reasonably foreseeable that if a person behaved in a certain way, that a Torah prohibition would come to be violated? But in the example you're giving, it seems pretty unlikely. I mean, kids left the ball. That could happen to anybody. You just happened to be walking over it. The ball ended up rolling, but you didn't cause that to happen with any kind of intent. It wasn't like you were, sort of throwing a ball from one place to another. You didn't intend it to go out into the public domain, but you did intentionally throw a ball. The result was not what you intended, but the initial action was intentional. Here, where you just tripped over the ball, this was totally without volition. The circumstances out of your control. You had no, positive action that came from your will. So I would think that you would not be liable in the situation you just described. Charles Shapiro, if you tithe the grapes, do you have to tithe the wine? That's a great question. And as I was teaching it, I was wondering this, like, why are they saying that? Do they? But I guess maybe not. Maybe yes, if you tied the grapes before you did that, but maybe that's not the way it's done when you're making wine, because the formula is not so exact, right? And so the thing that's being tithed is wine. And who knows, it's not always clear how many grapes are going to go in and how much wine is going to come out, depending on, how the fermenting is going and other factors that come into it. So it seems from what we're reading here that certainly the correct way to tithe wine is after you produce the wine and not tithing the grapes before. But really good question. Moshe says, Happy Rosh Chodesh from Abba in Nigeria. Wow, Moshe, Ewolonu, Okiezi, Eliyahu. So glad you're tuning in and commenting from Nigeria. Welcome to Accidental Talmudist Daily. It's so great to have you with us. And finally, Lynn says, while we all agree that spitting in front of others is impolite, it is a whole new level to see this as a forbidden action against Torah. So, very good, Lynn. Let's just actually review the halacha and then what Rav Steinsaltz says about it. So here is the halacha from Shulchan Aruch. One who expectorates phlegm or spittle in front of his master is considered to have acted in a disrespectful manner and will be punished by heaven, right? So this is one of those things. You violated the Torah law. You don't become liable to bring an offering. You're not going to be punished by an earthly court, but we are to understand that heaven takes notice of this and disapproves. And if you do enough of these kinds of sins pile up, your life can be shortened because of it. And for the same reason, one must be careful not to expel phlegm or spittle during prayer. Rav Steinsaltz adds, according to the interpretation of Resh Lakish, the verse does not refer to those who hate God or those who are hated by him. Rather, it speaks of those who cause people to hate him, i.e. those who desecrate the name of heaven. This idea is applied to scholars who act or dress inappropriately, right? So it's not even just, spitting or other bodily functions. I mean, the fact is, if you're a recognizable person of faith, you must hold yourself up to a higher standard of behavior because you're flying the flag, as it were, for God's army, right? You're sort of in God's army, and you have to behave like a respectable member of God's army. Otherwise, you desecrate the flag, right? You desecrate God's name, and you're sort of putting God's name upon yourself when you are visibly a person of faith. And this idea is applied to scholars who act or dress inappropriately, as such behavior leads others to disrespect the Torah. In this case, it refers to those who make themselves hateful to their masters, as the fear of one's master should be like the fear of heaven. Okay, and then if you're tuning in a little later, we should mention again that it's Rosh Chodesh Kislev, so we wish each other Chodesh Tov. That we should have a good month. We're entering the new month of Kislev, and this is the month of miracles. The month of miracles because it contains Hanukkah, the festival of miracles. So let's wish each other a Chodesh Tov. May the month of miracles bring miracles into your life only for the good. May blessings flow in abundance and beyond even your abundant imagination. The blessings should rain into your life from heaven. Wishing you all the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and a Chodesh Tov.